Today's date is October 19th, 2023. My name is Chad Gibbs, and I have the pleasure of interviewing Harry Schneider for the USC Shoah Foundation. Mr. Schneider, could you please introduce yourself and say and spell your first and last name, please?
I'm Harry Schneider, Harryschneider.
What was your name at birth?
Oh, my date of birth was Herschel Leib Schneider, spelled differently. The last name was spelled like a Polish. It's Znajder.
And what is your date of birth?
April 20th, 1937.
How old does that make you today?
I'm 86 years old now.
What was the name of the town that you were born in?
It was called Lomzi. In Polish, it was called Lomzi. In Yiddish, they called it Lomaz.
Can you tell us about your earliest childhood there in Poland?
Not very much. I was only like 2.5 years old when the war started, so I can't remember really much about the town. So all I know is what information that I've really gotten from my cousin, who was like 10 years older than I, and he spent many years with us, in Europe and so forth.
Mm.
So a lot of information I was able to get from him every time. He lived in Israel. He passed away a few years ago. So every time that we went to Israel, I was able to get more and more information as to, what happened in the town.
Mm.
Otherwise, I would not have known.
Understood. So, do you know whether you were from a very religious family, or what did your parents do for a living too?
My parents were, pretty religious. I think everybody in Lomzi was pretty religious. And my father was actually, he was in the army most of the time, in the Polish army before the war and during the war and so forth. And my mother just a home person. She did everything. And my father, I think he worked a lot like I guess with horses and stuff like that, and sold some stuff. And I'm not sure exactly, what he did. All I remember him being in the service, whether it was in the Polish army or in the Russian army. That I do remember him being that. Not much else really that I recall, prior to the war or during the war.
What was your mother and father's names?
My father's name was, in the United States, he changed his name to George.
Mm.
In Yiddish, it was Gedalia. And my mother's name in the United States was Gertrude, and her Yiddish name was Gittel. So those are, their names in Poland, in Yiddish names.
Do you remember your mother's maiden name?
My mother's maiden name's Feldman, so I do remember that.
Did you have brothers and sisters?
Did I?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I had a sister. Actually came with us, also survived the Holocaust, and she actually passed away about 3 years ago. I mean, she was about 4 years younger than I, but unfortunately, she came down with dementia, and she passed away about 3 years ago in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
And let's try to pick up in very early years. Oh, I should say, what was your sister's name?
Her name was Henya. Right, so that was her original name. She never changed it, so it was so she kept the same name.
What, if I asked, do you think would be your earliest memory? Can you think on that?
My earliest memory was probably, I must have been about 4 years old. I think when we escaped into Russia from Poland, and where the Russian government actually put us on a train, and they sent us to the Ural Mountains near Siberia.
Mm-hmm.
And I do remember just jumping off and on the trains. When the trains were bombed by the German Air Force, Luftwaffe. So I remember just That I remember. For the first thing, probably I can remember when we were jumping off up and down the trains because and then they were fixing the rails. So and then we had to get on again. It took us something like 3 weeks to get to our destination. So that I do remember. But so by that time, like I was like 4 years old.
Okay. And you were how old when the German invasion took place in Poland?
Well, the invasion was like September 1st, 1939. So I was like 2.5 years old.
Okay.
So that's why I I just don't remember anything that was happening in Poland at that time.
But you learned about those years later on. What did your family immediately do after the invasion?
Well, after the invasion, my father was actually at that time he was drafted into the Polish army, so he was in the Polish army, and of course Poland was defeated in a very short period of time, and he had just come home, and he had already seen some of the atrocities that were committed against the Jews, and a lot of people, a lot of the Jews were already placed in, in the ghettos and things like that. So he said, we're going to get out of here. We're not going to stay here. So we had an uncle who on the Russian side, and we figured that we would go. We just packed up whatever we could, and we just went to try to go over to the Russian side. However, there was a problem because there was a treaty between the Germans and the Russians, so we couldn't get on. We couldn't get into the Russian side. So we spent like 2 years, just running in the forest, trying to evade the Russians. Not the Russians, or the Germans. Sorry. Yeah. So we spent like 2 years in the forest before we were able to get into on the Russian side.
What do you know about those years in the forest?
I don't remember that much. Again, it started out, like I said, when we first left, I was maybe 2.5, 3 years old. So I don't remember too much. It was just pretty much what my parents, told me. That was, difficult to live, difficult to get food, but somehow we survived. So it was a difficult time.
For sure.
Yeah, but I don't remember much as far as being in the forest. All I remember is this: probably my parents or my father took me by my hand, and we just went wherever, kept on evading, the Germans. That's all. Kept on getting deeper and deeper into the forest. That's about all I can, I can remember, or at least what my parents told me.
Did they tell you much about that period of your life later on?
No, my parents, when we came to especially when we came to the United States, my parents didn't want to talk about the war at all. What happened to them? They just pretty much told me, "We brought you to the United States, and you make the best of it." Even if I didn't ask them too many questions, because even if I did ask them, sometimes my mother tried to say something, so my dad always told it, "Just shut up, don't talk about it. We're here," and so make the best that you can out of it.
Yeah, they didn't want to talk about that.
No, they didn't want to talk about it. Although, I found out, a lot later on, actually, from my cousin who lived in Israel, like he was 10 years older than I, and he spent many years with us in Russia and Poland and Austria and so forth. So every time we went to Israel, I just kept on asking him more and more questions about the family. I wanted to know what was going, what happened. So the information that I was able to get is really from him until he passed away, a few years ago.
So going back to just, I guess, from what you learned from him and later on, what do you know about how your family finally managed to get into the USSR?
Well, we were able to get in. I mean, like I said, once the treaty broke up between the Germans and the Russians, at least there was a space there, a time that we were able to get into Russia, and we had an uncle that lived there. He had a family, kids, and so forth. So we stayed with him for a short period of time. And actually, while we were in Russia, my sister was actually born in Russia, because she was born in 1941 while we were already in Russia. And I guess when as far as when the Germans kept on getting further and further into Russia, actually what happened is then the Russian government actually drafted my father, and also I had a cousin that came with us. They drafted him into the Russian army, and they put the family, myself, my sister, my mother, and the cousin, who I told you was like, his name was Baruch, by the way. They put us on a train, and they tried to get the family away as far as they could from the front. So that's why we wound up in the Ural Mountains, very, very close to Siberia. And as I mentioned to you, we took us something like 3 weeks to get there. So it was a long journey.
Where do you remember where this uncle's home was in Russia before you went into the Urals?
My uncle, well, right now it's, what is it called? Forget the name of it. It's not Ukraine.
Belarus?
Yeah, it was in Belarus. Yeah, it was in Belarus, where, of course, I mean, at that time, it was still, I guess, sort of part of Russia even now. But yeah, he lived in Belarus. Mm. So we stayed with him for several months until, they put us on a train and made us move. So from what I understand also, in that my uncle, we had 4 children and so forth, he didn't come with us, from what I understand, once the Germans invaded. They were all massacred. From I mean, I heard somehow my cousin told me as to what happened to them. Evidently, the whole family was massacred at that time. So they never, of course, I don't even know if they were able to come with us. Obviously, they couldn't, because that's all we found out. How it happened, I don't know. Once the Germans invaded, they were killed.
So your whole family goes to the Urals. Is your father still with you at that point?
No, my father was already drafted into the Russian army, and I had an uncle who came with us also. He was drafted into the Russian army. It's just my cousin, myself, my mother, and my sister. You know, they put us in a train, and they sent us, put us in a train and went to the, Ural Mountains near Siberia.
And she had to take care of all those little kids.
Well, no, just my cousin was already, he was a big boy already. Don't forget, it was by that time, let's say 41. I was like 4 years old already, so he was like 14 years old. He was a big boy already, and at that time in Europe, you grew up pretty fast. But yeah, so he was, he was with us most of the time. It's just that my mother was able to get a job actually in a railroad station. So I had to more or less, and my cousin, he did something else with feeding horses or something. I'm not sure how. Somewhere he had to take horses and feed them somewhere. He got paid something, and we wound up living with a Russian woman. They just placed us to live with a Russian woman whose husband was on the Russian front. So they more or less made her, keep us there. But we had to, find food. Also, we had to. A lot of times we went out with my cousin into the farms and something, try to acquire some food, borrow some food. But also there was, of course, the food was rationed, and a lot of times I had to get some milk, stay in lines with a bucket in line, get some milk for my sister, because she was like only 2 years old. So I more or less had to take care of her. And after
worked, and your cousin also worked.
Yeah, he also worked, and after a while I started going to school. Although it wasn't like a whole day, but a few hours. Went to school in Russia.
How long were you in that Russian lady's home in this Ural area?
We were there, I guess, from 41 to 45. So we were there, and she didn't like us really to be there, but I don't think she really had a choice. It's more or less like the government placed us there, and she had no choice. But it was difficult. I mean, with the food and living conditions and so forth. But somehow we survived. At the end of the war, I don't even remember how we found out the war ended, but somehow at that time, anybody that was born in Poland, they were able to go. We were able to go back. The Russian government then let us go back to Poland.
Before we go on to that phase, so you never moved around while you were in the Urals. It was always in that one woman's home? Pretty much, almost 41 to 45, yeah. Do you remember where it was? It might be hard to recall a town name.
Oh, I think the name was called Matveyevka. Yeah, it was an area there. I do remember the name, but I've never really tried to figure out where it was, but I still remember the name because going to school, you had to know where you're at.
Yeah.
So maybe after all this time, maybe I did forget it, but I think that's the name of it.
How about her name? Does her name come to mind? That Russian?
No, I do not remember at all her name. She wasn't that great of a person, so yeah. I don't remember. Yeah. I don't remember her name.
We talked about when we met. Did this woman try to convert you and your sister or something?
Oh, yeah, that's another story. She was a very religious person. She was always trying to talk about Christianity and try to convert us. Especially my sister was very gullible, so she would always spend a lot of time with her trying to convert her, but I guess it didn't happen. So I guess somehow we survived that.
So your sister and your mother and yourself all managed to go to Poland at the end of the war?
Yeah, we managed to go back to Poland also with my cousin. We went back to Poland, and I guess we wound up in a displaced persons camp. I don't remember in Poland yet. I don't remember the name really. Now my father, came back after the war. He came back with the Russian army into Poland, and he started searching for us. In fact, he went to Lomży to try to find out what happened to our house and the family, and he found out that the house was completely destroyed. And somehow he was able to tell, or people told him what happened to all the Jews there. They just took them outside of town into the forest, and they massacred them. And of course, the whole family that we had there, my grandparents and cousins. In fact, my mother had something like 5 brothers, and 3 of the brothers, lived there. So we found out there and their children, they were all massacred. And that's what my father was saying. There's no reason for us to stay here. So he was like the rest of the people who were trying to find a place. In other words, people who then found out that there was displaced persons camps in Austria and Germany, especially that were run by the U.S. So he decided that we're going to go to Austria, and we stayed there from 1945, 46 to 1950.
I'm still amazed. Do you know how at all that your father managed to find you?
How my father finished? No, of course, when he was in the Russian army, he was wounded. He was also wounded, but when he came back, don't forget we didn't have any cell phones at that time. But I guess, from what I understand, in different areas they had boards that everybody put their names on there, have you seen or heard of such and such a person? So when my father started to look, when he came back, from Russia, he was able to find us right there. He was able to find us. It was but it was a coincidence. Yeah. Everything was, as they say, beshert in Yiddish. How, but somehow he did it.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And in 45 or 46, you moved on from Poland to a DP camp in Austria? In Austria.
Near the large city was Linz in Austria. There was, I think, the DP camp was named Wegscheid. Was the name of the displaced persons camp there.
And how long were you there?
We were there until 1950. We were, in other words, by that time, like I mentioned to you, we had our cousin. In 1948, he decided to go with the other people, with the youth movement. They went to Israel, so he left us there. And we had an uncle, actually, that also was with us. He was able to get a visa to go to England. We had some cousins, so he was able to get a visa. And my father, it was even difficult. It was getting to Israel. He said, I can't travel anymore. He just, he was like, so he says, you're just going to wait. And until, was it 1948, I think President Truman permitted 100,000 Jews to come to the United States. So right away, my father signed us up, and it took us 2 years until 1950 in order to be able to get a visa.
What was life like before we moved on to the States? What was life like in the DP camp? Do you start having more memories at that time?
Oh, yeah, sure. By that time, I was already, 10, 11, 12 years old. Yeah, I mean, the living conditions, they were not great, but it was a lot better than being in Russia. Mm-hmm. I think there was, with the United States, there was some rations, there was some better food. And my father really opened up a little shop, like in a cellar of the building that we were in, where he was able to sell some candy and tobacco and things like that. So people were trying to have a little business going, doing something. Then they start trading. A lot of those people were doing some trading with the Austrians. In other words, a lot of times we went to where my father had to buy some stuff. I went with him to Linz, and so I remember the city. It was better. You couldn't live there forever, but it was a lot better than in Russia.
Do you remember meeting Austrians? What life all around Austria?
Yeah, it was not they didn't like the Jews. Very anti-Semitic, and they looked down upon us. But we had no choice. Parents didn't have any choice. You had to deal with them, and I had to deal with some kids. In other words, there was always a lot of. We were in DP camps, and they were right next to us, and so there's a lot of fights all the time between the kids. We got into a lot of fights with throwing stones, things like that. In other words, whoever took the upper ground was always, trying to look for fights.
Yeah, I haven't asked until now. I realized I should have about languages. What language? Tell us about your language history all the way up to the DP camps. There.
Oh, the languages. Well, first of all, when I was with my parents, even when I was 2 or 3 years old, even in the forest, we either spoke Yiddish or we spoke Polish. My parents spoke some Polish, and once we got into Russia, I started going to school also, even though it wasn't all day. But then I had to learn Russian. Mm-hmm. So I learned some Russian. So those 3 languages there. Then went to the VP camp in Austria. I learned some German. And also we had some emissaries that came, at that time it was Palestine, the Jewish, and so we had classes, we had school, and they taught us Hebrew. So I had to, I had learned some Hebrew, and those are some of the languages. And of course, we came to the United States. I couldn't speak a word of English, and I had a very good English teacher who stayed with me many hours after school, and in a short period of time, I was able to comprehend the language. And I still, so I had to have that. And then in business, I started traveling through Central and South America. I all of a sudden I had to learn Spanish. So, but I loved languages. It was easy, and especially in Europe, you can pick up a lot of languages, even Latvian or something like that. You can get by because knowing, let's say, like knowing Russian or Polish, on the other languages are very sort of similar, and so you can understand some more languages.
So how do you get, your father finally gets visas for you to go to the United States?
Yes.
I know that a lot of people recall the name of the ship they were on. Can you tell us about getting to the States and the name of the ship?
I remember because we had to, once we found out we were able to get a visa, we had to go to Bremerhaven, which is in Germany. So we stayed until I don't remember how long really it was. It had to be a couple of months because it had to be in April, because actually I was 13 years old and I was actually bar mitzvahed there. It must have been, I don't know if it's a synagogue, whatever it is, but it wasn't much of a bar mitzvah.
In Bremerhaven? Yeah,
Bremerhaven. So we waited for the ship to come so we can go to the United States. And actually the Jewish community in Washington, Pennsylvania, which is right outside of Pittsburgh, was actually sponsored us. So that's how we came to the United States.
Was that through any major organization like HIAS?
HIAS, yeah. HIAS actually took part of it, but you had to have a sponsor. You either had to have family in the United States or somewhere else. We didn't have any, at least we didn't know of any families that we had in the United States. So it happened that the Jewish community in Washington, Pennsylvania sponsored us. Evidently, from what I understand, prior to us, they had another family, also survivors, that they had. But that family found some relatives in Canada, so they moved on to Canada. So maybe, and I don't recall the reason, but maybe because they just wanted to have another family, Holocaust survivors there. So that's how we wound up in Washington, Pennsylvania.
So let's try to put that in timeline. How old were you, do you think, when you got to Pennsylvania?
I was 13 years old. Like I said, I was bar mitzvah in April, and we came to Washington, Pennsylvania, I think in November. The ship was Langfit, SS General Langfit. Yeah, I do remember that, the name of the ship.
And how does your family start life in the United States? Do you remember what your father took on as an occupation? And your mother?
Well, once whoever sponsored you had more or less had to give us a place to stay, like for 6 months. So, they gave us an apartment, which, they paid for. They also had to find a job for my father. And there was a person, a Jewish person in Washington. He had a steel mill. So that's my father started to work over there in the steel mill. Mm. So that's how it started in Washington, Pennsylvania.
And your mother kept home?
Yeah, pretty much she kept home for, not only for my father, I mean, for my sister and myself. She was just a homemaker. That's pretty much she. Mm. Yeah, she didn't really do much else. She still had, she had a difficult time as far as even with the language. She spoke very little English. till she passed away. My father, was able, because he was with other people, English-speaking people, he was able to understand and speak a little bit of English.
Did your language at home remain Yiddish, or?
At home, yes, I would say so. But of course, in school, I wanted to become Americanized really quick.
Mm-hmm.
So, and luckily in that little town of Washington, there weren't too many Jewish people. So I didn't have that many people to speak Yiddish with. So as far as students are concerned, it was mostly, English. So that's why I was able to comprehend and able to speak a lot quicker than normal. I mean, if I would have lived, let's say, like in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is a big city, there was a lot of Jewish people that still spoke Yiddish and stuff like that. So it could have been a different situation.
Yeah. Did your sister speak Yiddish at home too?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, she did. But she, I guess she forgot. She really, once she came to, she also got married and to somebody, somebody from Pittsburgh. And she lived in Pittsburgh also, just like I did. I married, Patty, who lived in Pittsburgh, local. And, but my sister forgot it. She really didn't remember anything. She didn't want to remember anything, what happened to her. She couldn't remember anything. I would have thought that she would remember something, it was from the DP camps or it was from Russia, but it was completely erased from her mind. She really didn't talk about it, or every time we try to talk about it, she just wasn't really with it.
So your father worked in a steel mill, and I imagine you went immediately to school. And
yeah, I went to high school. They placed me in 8th grade.
Huh.
I don't know why, but of course we had school in the DP camp, so I knew like math and other things. But of course, the only thing I didn't know English. But they figured they'd place me there and see what happened. So it didn't take me long until they finally realized that's where I belong. So I graduated with my class and everything else, and didn't have any problems. I probably by the time I was 14, I actually got a job. I had to make some money somewhere, so I got a job in a clothing store. First of all, I think you had to be like 16 years old in order to be in the front, selling or anything like that. So almost for 2 years, I had to be more or less in the stock room or cleaning the windows, things like that. But I think I made something like $10 a week, which was a big money for me at that time. It was a big savings.
And when did you graduate high school, or did you graduate?
Yeah, I graduated in 1955.
Okay.
Yeah, I graduated in 1955 high school, and then I started going to college. Actually, also in Washington Jefferson College in Washington, PA. And it was tough. Of course, you needed some money, but I actually stayed, I guess, for about 2 years. I stayed in college, and I ran out of money.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to work for a couple more years, and went back to college to finish the diploma.
And what in, by the way?
Economics. Yeah, but I did that, and then let's see. Then I had to go to then I was told that I was very close. At that time, they had a draft for the Army. So I was told that I was very close to being drafted into the Army. So I had a choice, either to wait to be drafted, or I could have joined, which I did. I joined the National Guard. So I joined the National Guard, and I had to go in for a 6-month basic training.
Mm-hmm.
And then a total of 6 years. I I had to be in the National Guard, and they had like every I think once a month they had like a weekend of training, and then also during the summer, I think there was like a 2 weeks you had to go into camp and all that stuff. So it lasted about 6 years.
Yeah. When did you go in?
I went into actually 1959. Yeah, I went to 1959 for basic training. Yeah, and it was already it was 60. Yeah, because we got because we got married in 1962. Yeah, so I got to know Patty, and kept on going from Washington, PA to Pittsburgh, so off and on.
How did you meet Patty?
Oh, that's another story. That's interesting. I actually met her in Wheeling, West Virginia, which is not far either from Washington or Pittsburgh. Patty had a cousin who lived actually in Wheeling, West Virginia, and there was a dance that she belonged to, BBG, which is a Jewish girls, and I belonged to AZA. Okay.
Fraternity?
Well, it's not a fraternity. It's like an organization. So I happened to be going there, and she was also there with her cousin. So I met her at a dance over there, and we started. We didn't next. So this was like 59. Yeah, so she could, because she graduated high school in 1960. But we didn't go together all the time. I just, I knew her, and then it's like anything else. I still live in Washington, PA. Sometimes my friend, I didn't have a car or anything, so one of my friends had a car. So anytime they went to Pittsburgh, I went with him, and we sort of double dated, and sometimes with Patty, sometimes with other girls. So somehow, eventually we got together. I think 1960 or so. I've known her probably a couple of years before we got married. We got married in 1962.
And you're still together?
Yeah, it's going to be actually the end of this month. It's going to be like 61 years.
61 years.
Yeah, I know.
And do you have how many kids?
We have 2 children. We have the son who still lives in Pittsburgh right now. He has 2 children, a boy and a girl. And our daughter, Tracy, I think you just met her over there with her husband, Jim. They live nearby. And that's how we wound up, because of them, we wound up here in the Charleston area.
What's your son's name?
My son, Michael.
So I should probably go back in time a little bit and ask you about your career.
Oh, okay. That's a good one. When I came out of the service, basic training, I started also. I didn't have enough. Well, I wanted to be an accountant, and I didn't have that much of an accounting, as far as degrees concerned, going to college. So I started going in the evenings. I went to Robert Morris University. So I took more of accounting. I was probably going there off and on in the evenings, like for 2 years. So I guess it was like it was 1962. After a couple of years. And I was looking to get a job, so I got a job for a company as an accountant. So I was there. I was there for I don't know for how many, maybe a year or two. And it was an import company. It was actually the company bought beef from Australia, New Zealand, Central America, and so forth. And I was there as an accountant probably for about a year or 2 years. And the director of imports there, all of a sudden, he like disappeared. So the boss asked, it was a tough job. I mean, it was a tough people to work for. Mm-hmm. So the guy, the boss over there, the owner, asked, does anybody know what this guy was doing? And I says, you know what? I raised my hand. I says, well, I helped him. He wasn't that strong in accounting, so I helped him with accounting and so forth. I says, you see that desk over there? I says, you sit there. That's your job now. So I became the director of imports. And after a short period of time, I start traveling with the boss to Central America, like Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama, all those. So I learned the business, the import business, and all the cows and everything else about him. So that's how I got into that. And after a period of time, he says, well, that's your job there. So after a while, actually, the guy also had a home in Pittsburgh and also in Florida. So he says, well, I'm tired of traveling much. So you say, you better learn how to travel. So that's how all of a sudden I started doing all the things by myself. And I guess after being there, let's see here, you're talking about 62, probably in, maybe I was there maybe 5 years. And more or less, I got nice raises and everything else. But when more or less the boss told me, he just told me, like, I says, look, I can give you more money, but I just want to tell you, you're not going anywhere in the company. Because he had his son, well, actually, his son was over there, and he had his grandchildren already coming in. He says, they're going to take over. So I figured after 5 years that I knew enough that I started my own company, more or less as not a competitor, a friendly competitor. I was always friendly. I never, so that's when I started doing everything on my own. And I start traveling, to Australia, New Zealand, Central America to buy beef. And I did this until, I'm trying to think, until I was like, so it's already 16 years ago, until I was about 70 years old. Then I was very fortunate to be able to sell the company to a banker. But that's how, I made a living.
Mm-hmm. And when did you retire and sell and retire?
I retired when I was 70 years old. So you're talking about 16 years ago. In other words, I worked for the individual, I think about a year and a half. And I guess finally he told me, he says, you know what? He says, I'm not going to pay you anymore. I can do it on my own. So that's how I figured, okay, it's time to, I was 70 years old. It was time to retire. So I was very happy to find somebody that was able to buy my business.
And your children were grown, and you had the choice to move to Charleston at some point?
Well, no, actually, we had a place in Florida. We actually, what we did usually, December was a very slow month in our business. So I was able to go to Florida, most of the time Delray Beach. So a lot of times went there with the kids and everything. So we liked the place. And I think in 2010, I think when the market was down and everything, we bought a place in a community there. So we lived there until I guess it's 2.5, almost 3 years. So we lived there permanently. After a while, we left Pittsburgh and we lived there for a few years. And unfortunately, we had an automobile accident about 2.5, 3 years ago, and that's when our daughter actually moved from Pittsburgh to the Charleston area. We had a grandson, her son. We actually worked here on an ABC channel. He was a photographer, actually. So he got a job over here So our daughter, in fact, also myself and my wife came here a few times, and we liked the area. So after the accident, our daughter more or less, you better move closer so we can be. So that's why, in fact, she's here. So that's why we're here, because of her.
So when do you think you began talking about the Holocaust?
When the sick, well, I guess the time it's had to be maybe 20 years ago.
Mm.
So I didn't think, and this was in Pittsburgh, I never thought I was really a Holocaust survivor.
Mm.
I figured I was just a child. And my grandson, when he was going to school, I think it was 8th or 9th grade. And, they were talking about, I guess, in a history class, talking about, World War II and the Holocaust. And she asked the students, says, by the way, does anybody have a relative, that went through the Holocaust? So my grandson puts his hand up. Yeah, my grandfather. So then, then the teacher called and asked me, he said, would you mind talking about the Holocaust? And I said, no, certainly. I've never spoken to anybody about it. So this is how I started talking to the school children there. And, there's a lot of questions and so forth. And at that time, I figured that I should get more involved, even though I was still working. But so I tried to get more involved with the Holocaust Center in Pittsburgh. And there were speakers over there. There's some good speakers over there. I didn't consider myself a good speaker. I still don't. But I figured that I have a story to tell and people should hear. So that's how it started. And then my other grandson, the older one, also had me talking where he was already in high school. So I spoke to some of the kids there, and then all of a sudden the Holocaust Center asked me to speak to other students, other classes over there, whether it was school or somewhere else. Even I think even one time I even went to the penitentiary. Yeah, to speak over there. So which I did.
So about when would you date beginning to speak publicly?
You're talking about to students?
Yeah.
Well,
or
I would say probably 20 years ago. Yeah, I'd say 20 years ago. The first one, as I said, with my grandson, who asked me, which the teacher asked me to speak about it.
Do you feel that you have like a personal reason that you want to tell your story, or a goal in mind?
Yes, I think that people should know about what happened to me, even though I always tell them, I says, look, you probably have heard a lot of people, being in concentration camps and so forth. That wasn't my story.
Mm-hmm.
Even though, I think I suffered quite a bit, but I didn't have to go to concentration camps with some of the other people. So I have a story to tell. And I always, try to tell them, that they always ask me, says, how do you think all this happened? What happened? I mean, I don't tell them the whole story. I mean, you can talk this forever with Hitler, how he came to power and everything. I wasn't about to get into that, and I figured you guys should learn that from school, from history and so forth. But the most important thing, it's the hatred and prejudice is what I tell them, that you have to stay away from that. And of course, the situation with like the Prime Minister of Iran is saying there's no Holocaust. I tell them, you read about the Holocaust, and you heard about my situation. So there was a Holocaust, and you have to remember that and stay away from prejudice and hatred. That's the main thing. That's the reason why even here in the Charleston, if they need me to speak to students or anyone else, I'll be glad to do it.
We're very glad that you do too. How many times do you think you've told your story in the Charleston area?
Well, we've only been here like a year and a half. And I would say to students probably 4 or 5 times in the past year. When school was on, don't forget, during the summer, school was out. And just the other day, I was over to the James Island Library over there. They had over 40 people, adults, that was there was advertised in the Post. That so I went over there and spoke about myself and what happened to me, and we were there probably about an hour and a half. I also showed them the film that I had about the escape to Siberia, which I have, which was made at the Holocaust Center in Pittsburgh. So there was a lot of questions about myself, the family, and how I survived and so forth. So I more or less I told the Jewish Federation here is whenever they need me to speak anywhere, I'd be glad to do it.
Let's try to list those things that you've done for Holocaust education. You've been in a film, Escape to Siberia. You give public talks. I don't want to leave anything out.
No, my grandson went to the University of Maryland. He majored in journalism, so he had to do some type of a project. So he did a project to show, which also is on a film about my experience. So he has done that, and that's been shown many times. A lot of times when I was in Pittsburgh, I showed that to the students. In other words, I feel when a student sees something, it's better than just to speak about it, because sometimes they'll listen to you. I've seen some of them. Most of them will listen, but a few of them fall asleep. But when they look at a film to show exactly what happened, you have a lot of more questions that they will ask. And there's always at least an hour, and sometimes an hour and a half of questioning, asking about the film, about myself, and so forth.
That's excellent. So you usually, when you give your talk, you'll show the film and then ask questions or answer questions.
Exactly. Either the one like on Tuesday, I showed the way he escaped. There's one that I did in Pittsburgh, Escape to Siberia. Mm-hmm. And so I showed that. Sometimes I'll show it to the students. The other one that my grandson did, it's, what do they call it? One man's story, something like that. So either that. Now the Pittsburgh, it's quite a few. It's make 5 or 6 years. The other one's only about 2 years, but my grandson did.
So I think we're coming closer toward the end of our talk, but I wanted to make sure, just a very broad question, if we missed anything that you want to include in your interview. Any questions that I should have asked that we didn't cover?
I don't know what it might be. I mean, you asked about, my town, Poland, which I really, like I told you, I didn't really know that much about. I was too young. Being in the forest for 2 years, there again, knew very little. It's just what my cousin, who I mentioned to you, Baruch, told me about, which I knew. Well, he also told me a lot about the town, the small town, the shtetl, as they call it. He told me a lot about what he did, how he went to Cheder, and all these other places. So he told me a lot, which I understood what happened, when I was right before I was born or when I was born. But this cousin also, you might have mentioned, or I didn't mention, actually, the reason he was with us, my mother actually raised him. But that's another story. What happened is when he was like, I think 2 years old, his mother passed away. We don't know. She was bitten by something, a bee or something. And my uncle, his father, actually before the war started, he went to Argentina. He went to Argentina. He was a tailor. He was a good tailor. So he figured he would go to Argentina, make a living, and bring the family over.
Mhm.
Obviously, the war started and never happened. So in the meantime, my mother, actually, she didn't get married until, 30, 35. So she didn't get married for a while because she had to take care, actually, my cousin. Because, like I said, he was like 10 years older than I. She took care of him. So she really got married late in life. So that's why he was like a brother to me, more or less, like instead of a cousin. So that's also why I keep in touch with his children and grandchildren in Israel right now. So we're very close.
And that brings up a chance for us to ask you about what's happened in Israel in the last week, as we are now in October of 2023 when we're recording this. Is your family okay?
So far, in other words, they're okay. A lot of times, when the rockets being fired, or even over Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, they have to go into a safe room and come out whenever. And I know that their children, some of them are up in the front now, being called up into the army. So they're concerned about it, and I either try to text or call my cousin. I call him a cousin, but that's actually my brother's child. So he's in his I'm trying to think now. He's got to be, time marches on. He's got to be about 50 years old. So he was also in the army. He was a pilot in the Israeli Air Force, and he got injured. So he hasn't been called up. So I'm not even sure up to what age they really get called up. I understand till 49, but I'm not 100% sure. So it's a serious situation right now, and as we know, Israel is getting blamed for everything. And a lot of times, as we saw just the other day with the situation there in the hospital, they're blaming on Israel, and Israel has proven that it wasn't them. It was one of the rockets that didn't go past, didn't go on the Israel side. So, but nobody's going to believe it. So already, the Hamas and everybody else is saying it's Israel's fault. It's difficult. It was a very, very difficult time for me to watch some of the things that have been happening. Mm-hmm. A lot of times I really forgot about what happened to me as a child. Mm-hmm. But all of a sudden with this situation, it was very difficult for me to watch. It felt like I was there. I happened to be right there in Israel. The atrocities that were committed by Hamas to the Israelis. It's like I could imagine, even myself being at that age, being in the forest and so forth, with the Germans coming after us and so forth. It felt like I was almost there. So it was very difficult for me to watch, although I've seen many, many movies about, the Holocaust and everything. Sure, I felt bad about it, but it didn't bother me as much as this past week watching the film and some of the atrocities that were committed by Hamas. It was just, it just brought me back to almost when I was a child. So it was very difficult to watch. But I don't know of anything else really that we could cover. Pretty much, I think we spoke about the early stage in Poland, forest, Russia, the displaced persons camps, and my work, my schooling. I really don't know unless you can come up with anything else that you can think of.
I'd like to end on something along the lines of the same question every time, and I'd like to ask you. You tell your story, and you also spoke about the violence in Israel right now. And I wondered if through telling your story and thinking about things like that, that you have any form of message for the future, or something you'd like to share for the people who watch this video in the future.
No, the only thing, like I said before, the biggest problem that I see is prejudice, and that's what I think caused. I mean, caused the like World War II with Hitler. So the only thing I can leave is that we tell the people, we try to stay away from that. You know, hatred and prejudice. That's the most. Now, how can we do this? I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. Evidently, you know, even if we think about it, it's still happening. So you try to be a good person. That's the only thing I can tell everybody. Try to be as best as you can, and to tell the truth as to what's happening, which a lot of times we're not hearing, whether it's in the news or whatever else. So I'm hope that this doesn't happen again. But as we can see all over the world, things are happening. That's about all that I can really tell you.
It makes a great deal of sense. And I just want to thank you on behalf of the USC Shoah Foundation and myself for recording this interview. I think it's very, very important and does something to help that future as you're talking.
Yeah, I hope so. Like I said, if you're interested in watching the story about my grandson, I'll be happy to show you where it is, or the ones that the other one was in Pittsburgh. I'll be glad to give you all the information.
We'll take down the links, and perhaps we can put that in the links.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah, that might be interesting.
But thank you very, very much.
Okay. You're quite welcome.